Okay, we're going to get started. We're going to get started now. This room is sponsored by Rubicon. The Rubicon project has engineered the advertising automation cloud, one of the largest real-time cloud and big data computing systems. The company's mission is to automate the buying and selling of advertising by offering innovative products to connect buyers and sellers globally. For more information, visit rubiconproject.com. We'd also like to request that you take a moment to visit the speaker survey. It's on the back of your badge, or it's on the card that your badge was printed with. We appreciate that. That helps us with future SCaLE. Okay, our next talk is on human hacking. Our speaker is Emily Dunham, and this talk explains some basic models of human motivation and behavior and includes examples of applying them in the world of open source software. So without further ado, I give you Emily.
Hi there, everybody. So you're here because you want to learn things about people, things about applied psychology in the world of open source. This may include herding cats in project leadership or getting started in your first project and figuring out what the right project for that would be. So hi, I'm me. I'm E. Dunham. That's my site. URL is actually SCaLE13x because I realized it had a real name. There's my GitHub. The slides are made with hieroglyph. And just to mention the other relevant thing about me right now, I am a finalist for the Red Hat Women in Open Source Award. So there's a link if you happen to feel like voting. So I am a fifth-year student at Oregon State University. I've been involved in engineering and leadership since FIRST Robotics in high school. I've run the OSU Linux Users Group for a couple of years and then handed that off. I've been involved in a variety of other open source projects. So I've been doing this stuff for a while. So what I'd like to talk to you about today are some theories about people from psychology that will be relevant, some theories about individuals, and then theories about how groups interact, the way you can apply this as a contributor in the free and open source software world, and the way you can apply these to leadership. So a few things to keep in mind. It's always hard to pick a starting point when you're jumping into a totally new subject, just like how designing curricula is hard as a teacher. But I've picked places that seem to make sense, and if you think they don't make sense, yell at me on the internet and I will fix it for another time I give this talk. And the ideas that I'm talking about and the questions that I'm going to encourage you to ask yourselves in order to get what you want out of your open source contribution are further from having objectively correct answers than most of the problems you're probably used to day to day as a developer, as a systems administrator, poking at computers and having the computer say yes or no. So I'm not going to ask you to just blindly do things because I say to. I'm going to ask you to pay more attention and take kind of the same approach you do to troubleshooting and problem solving with computers to the way that you interact with people as well. So a few theories about individuals, and theories that focus on individuals will tend to have much more detail than theories about group interaction and discuss kind of motivation and behavior. So first thing to keep in mind is that you live in a human emulator. This helps you predict the responses and behavior of people who are similar to you. Do not assume that it works correctly on people who are different from you. Have you ever taken an emulator for one game system and loaded up a ROM for a different system? It's probably not going to do what you want. So for instance, if you're trying to invite conversation with people, like if you want to just find out about a project, make new friends online, pay attention to when you feel safe approaching someone and then actually do, and then try to give a situation those traits. So just, I will come back to this again and again, that this is a really good way of predicting people who are similar to yourself. Something to recognize about nearly everyone is that people have a personal narrative, a story that they tell themselves about who they are, about why they do what they do. This is not always strictly true in the sense that if you did a really comprehensive study on the person, the reasons they think they have might not be the quote-unquote actual reasons. However, people try generally to be consistent about things, and recognizing what traits someone really values about themselves can help you show them how a given contribution will make them more of the kind of person that they want to be. So, for instance, if someone says, oh, I'm really intelligent, and that's how they feel about themselves and how they judge themselves, then thanking them for having a really clever solution is probably going to be more influential on their motivation and their enjoyment of your project than thanking them for having worked really hard. Whereas someone who says to themselves, yep, I may not always get it the first time, but I really keep trying, and that's why I'm a good contributor, will appreciate thanks for their effort perhaps more than thanks for, oh yeah, you ended up with a good solution. One rather old psychologist, guy by the name of Maslow, formed this theory called the hierarchy of needs. And basically what he said is that there are a variety of needs that humans try to fulfill. And once the lower needs are fulfilled, they'll move on to trying to get the upper needs. So there have been some criticisms of this, especially with his putting something he calls self-actualization on top of the pyramid, but ultimately the idea that when people need certain things before they'll go on to look for others can be really useful, especially in explaining sudden changes of behavior. One example of this is during the story of the lulsec thing a couple years back. There was a hacker who went by Sabu, and he was acting in the interests of his group of hackers for a while and acting against the government and all that, fulfilling kind of belonging and esteem needs by doing things that he thought he probably, I would assume, thought were morally right based on his personal worldview. But then he got arrested, and I think it would be safe to assume that he may have thought that his health, well-being, and safety needs were suddenly threatened, and then his behavior changed radically, and he started working against the hacker group and with the government instead. So sudden changes in behavior, look at which needs people are trying to fulfill and whether there's been a sudden change in how those are being met. Another way of modeling people that I like, not so much because of the exact research behind it, but because of all the supporting literature that people have developed, is called the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator Test. Basically, a couple of psychologists back in the day designed a test and statistically analyzed a bunch of questions to force dichotomies in people's preferences for how they approach human interaction, extroversion versus introversion, how they process information that comes in, how they prefer to make decisions, and then a couple of meta traits of which of those are stronger. The exact details don't matter nearly as much as the fact that it models kind of stereotypes of some very different styles of interaction and styles of working together, and then they write up these matrices of how each set of styles combines. So reading that kind of thing can give you an idea of what kind of questions to ask when, let's say, an introvert who's very, very data-driven is trying to come to a consensus with an extrovert who's really concerned about how the results of what they do is going to make people feel. One thing to bear in mind, if you get interested in this kind of test, you can do a self-assessment for it, but there's an effect called the Forer effect that, to me, I would say explains why horoscopes work. It says that individuals will give high accuracy ratings to descriptions of their personality that are supposedly tailored specifically for them, but are in fact vague and could apply to anybody. So again, this is useful in that it models interactions between very different kind of dichotomized personality types, more so than as necessarily a predictor of like telling you exactly how you are. Another thing to be aware of with individuals, did I skip a slide? I skipped a slide, are what's called cognitive biases. These are basically to everyday life and interaction what logical fallacies are to debate. They're deviations from what Homo economicus, the hypothetical, purely perfectly rational person that people try to work from models of, would do. There is a massive list of them. It's on Wikipedia. It's linked in my slides. And I've also linked a couple of perhaps more accessible summaries of them. But basically, they're places where, for a variety of reasons, we'll mistake things for things that they aren't and just distort them in our perceptions, and then that distorts the actions that we take. A really relevant one in open source and in technology are overconfidence and underconfidence effects. So you've all probably worked on some piece of software or some project. Have you ever said, oh yeah, I can just have this feature done in a couple of days. It shouldn't take more than a few hours. Yeah. And then it takes like a week because something unexpected happened. That's called the planning fallacy, tendency to overestimate the rate of work or underestimate time frames. They developed the entire Agile methodology to try to combat this, and it kind of works. So basically, overconfidence effects show up in every software project ever. There's also underconfidence effects, where people who are aware of perhaps just how much there is to know will underestimate the importance of the stuff that they already do know, such as the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is where skilled people have a better perspective on the things they don't know, and thus they tend to assume that their skill level is lower, whereas unskilled people are also often relatively uninformed about how much more there is to know. So they go, oh, I know all the things that I'm aware of, so I must be pretty darn good at this. False. But there's also, you'll hear the people who discuss diversity in tech often talk about imposter syndrome, which is where people will go, oh, I'm just faking it or what have you. It's another underconfidence effect. If you think that you're experiencing that, it's good to read up on. That can help you combat it by at least recognizing it and then quantifying your own contributions and trying to get a more accurate picture of what you are good at. So a positive thing about the human brain is that we are just incredible at pattern recognition. The fact that you can look out into a room and recognize people's faces, recognize which individual a given face goes with, is actually just about a miracle of processing. It's really hard for computers to do. This is why CAPTCHAs kind of sort of work for at least forcing a human spammer to fill in the form, because recognizing those patterns that form images is something that the human brain is incredibly good at, and it's really hard to do computationally. So in a broader sense, this pattern recognition effect that's kept our ancestors alive for a very long time means that we tend to recognize meta patterns sometimes that aren't there. This can result in applying stereotypes based on a subset of information or jumping to incorrect conclusions. So relevant to that is an effect called priming. Basically, if you go into a situation expecting a given outcome, that outcome is more likely. If they've done some experiments, which I've linked to a bunch of summaries of the studies, again in my slides, in my notes, where you'll prime a person, get them really thinking about a given stereotype. Like, let's say you want to see if they're more studious and diligent and detail-oriented, so you prime them with all of these images of like a secretary who's really detail-oriented, really focused, but perhaps not the most innovative. And then you give them tasks to test how detail-oriented and how innovative they're being. They will be more detail-oriented and less innovative when they've been primed with images of like a secretary than they would be if you'd primed them with images of, let's say, a mad scientist, where they're likely to be more innovative but less detail-oriented. Same if you prime people with images of old people, they walk measurably slower down the hall when they're leaving your study. Really interesting effect. You can use this to your advantage in open source, and like if you have control over what somebody sees when they get into the first page of your project, you'll notice that a lot of projects will emphasize like, here's what you can do. Here's why it's really important to help get people into that mindset of, again, playing on that personal narrative of, why yes, I am civic-minded, and this is clearly the kind of place where I can do something civically involved and help out, and that may make people more likely to contribute. Final thing that's really important to keep in mind about the individual human brain is that we are terrible at multitasking. We basically don't multitask. in much the way that a single core of a computer doesn't really multitask. We can context switch, but that has a lot of overhead to it. They've done a bunch of studies on this. They found slight gender differences between abilities, but everybody does worse if they do the same two tasks broken up into a bunch of pieces and interspersed than just do one task and get it done, do another task and get it done. So it also will keep you distracted if you're worrying about the last thing that you context switched from, and that recollection of the last context kind of basically fires an interrupt into whatever you're doing, forces another context switch, and can be really problematic. So I'm going to mention the power of calendars here. Since it's really advantageous to focus on one thing at a time, if you pick a time to do the future thing and write it down, it's no longer really a problem. If it tries to interrupt you, you can just go, yeah, I have a time when I'm going to deal with that, and work on one thing at a time. So a few theories about groups. I'll start with the scariest one first, which is, again, an old experiment, but I think it's relevant to at least be aware of if you have any position of power or position of leadership. This is the Milgram obedience experiment. He wrote a book on it. The ISBN is in the slide notes. It's basically the effect of people taking an action when you would expect an inaction from them. The way they set up the experiment is the guy pushing the button is the actual subject. He thinks that he's supposed to be teaching the guy in the room this list of words. And every time the guy in the room in the chair gets a word wrong, the experimenter tells the real subject, you have to give him an electric shock to teach him. And the guy in the room is actually an actor. He's not really getting zapped, but the experimenter, the subject in the study, doesn't know that. He thinks he's actually shocking a person in order to help the researcher learn about teaching. So when the subject starts going, no, I don't think this is a good idea, it looks like I'm hurting him, the researcher will give a few prods, like, please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It's absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice but to continue. And 2/3 of participants continue to the highest level of shocking the person, which would have actually killed the person if it had not just been an actor. So this was really shocking when it first came out. It's been discussed over and over, so it's, well, terrible word choice there. It was really astonishing to people when it first came out. It's been discussed over and over, so people are more familiar with the effect. He did 18 different variations of it to make sure it wasn't just the prestige of the university or something that was convincing people to continue, but he narrowed it down that it was the authority of the guy in the lab coat. So if you have a metaphorical lab coat in any project or any situation, be aware that people won't necessarily say no to you or won't necessarily say no as emphatically as you would expect that they should. So kind of in the opposite way, but similarly problematic, we've got the bystander effect, which is an effect of inaction when you would expect action. The presence of other people around decreases the likelihood that any given individual will help out if they perceive an emergency happening. Like you're walking down the street and somebody collapses. If you're the only person there, you'll probably go over, go, are you okay, try to call 911. But if there's other people around, you'll be like, oh, one of them will get it, kind of thing. This also shows up in leadership. Have you ever had a leader go, okay, somebody needs to do such and such a task, and then that task just never gets done? To mitigate it, pick out a specific individual and make it their problem. You say, you do this, you do that. In CPR training, they tell you about the bystander effect, and you say, you call 911. You go find the defibrillator, rather than just somebody do it. So be aware of that, and you can work against it. So another experiment, again an older one that has been replicated again and again, are the Asch conformity experiments, which are basically proof that peer pressure is real. The way you run an experiment like this is you'll have a group of people that the real subject, the guy without the hat, thinks are also just in the experiment, but really they're working with the scientists. They'll all give the same wrong answer publicly, and the person who can tell and knows what the right answer is, they survey them afterwards, they know what the right answer is, will give the same wrong answer as the group, because it causes them to doubt whether they're correct, and people are really strongly motivated to conform. So this can show up in open source if you have public voting, public surveys, public mailing list discussions of whether we should use a particular feature, and the way to mitigate it will really depend on the context, but be aware that peer pressure is real, peer pressure works very strongly, and people would rather assume that they as an individual are wrong than that the group is wrong, usually. Fortunately, we have some people who disagree. Yeah? The question is, what about in an anonymous voting type situation? If the person can't see what the other people are voting, then conformity effects are not really in play as much, but if there's a context that can give them some clues as to what the group thinks, and if they think that their vote is likely to be exposed, then conformity effects become relevant. So another thing that comes up when we're talking about interactions between groups are social scripts or expectations. They're basically, a social script is a lot like a dialogue that you would have with an NPC in a video game. And I'm not saying that other people are NPCs, I'm saying that the roles that people play, like the roles of, let's say, waiter and diner in a restaurant, have certain scripts that are associated with them. These can be really helpful to be aware of and to leverage if there are new situations that you're going into that you're really uncomfortable with and otherwise wouldn't really be willing to do. You can figure out what script is going to be in play and get somebody who is more experienced with that situation to help you prepare yourself for it. Another effect in groups when you talk about somebody helping you out is this reciprocity thing. Basically, when somebody has helped you, you feel more inclined to help them. And this also ties in with what we call an attribution error fallacy, where if you can get someone to help you, even if they don't necessarily like you very much right then, they'll kind of rewrite their own personal history and conclude, well, I helped that person, that must mean that I like them, right? Because I help people when I like them, and it makes them have generally a higher opinion of you. So that's hard to test empirically, but it's an effect that has been observed quite a bit. Another thing in individual interactions are mirroring and body language. Like these two stick figures, can you tell if they're interested, if they're having a conversation and kind of really engaged with one another? They kind of look like it, which is a miracle of pattern recognition that a bunch of lines on a screen seem to be conveying any emotion. And what they're doing right there that you've recognized the pattern of is mirroring. Typically, if someone wants to show interest and engagement, they will take a similar posture. They will lean in and look toward the other person. And similarly, if somebody wants out of a situation, they will kind of close up their body language, look away, point their feet away from the person that they're talking with, like they're trying to get out. These can also be cues as to whether someone actually wants to hear about this crazy project that you're working on or if they're just being polite. So with all of those things, I'm about to get into some applications, but there are a couple of kind of disclaimers to go with this. You can turn ordinary experiences into education about humans by being open-minded, being observant, and identifying and correcting for your own biases, like your mood, whether you're hungry, whether there's other stuff that's made you grumpy. Any of those can color your perception of a situation. And just like with any science, make an observation, what happened, make a hypothesis of why it happened, and then you can optionally perform an experiment of how will changing the inputs change the output. Sometimes it's best to keep that experiment just as a thought experiment. Brain is a human emulator again. Go, how might they have responded if I'd done this differently? Another thing when you start applying social engineering is the question of getting what you want. The first thing to do is to identify what it is that you want. And the second concern is being kind of careful of what you wish for. If it generally makes life worse for other people or harms other people, it's probably not ultimately advantageous to you to to go do that, because remember what you thought of the last person that actively hurt you? You probably do not ever want to do nice things for them. And if you do want something that seems like it would harm others, examine whether your actual goal, or what you're trying to get to through that, could be accomplished some other way. Another thing to be careful of is to choose your words carefully, choose your terms carefully, because the way in which you frame a given situation can kind of prime people for what they expect to get out of it. And it's really important to specify what your goal is rather than assuming that your audience will guess correctly. It's important to recognize the limitations of models and theories and experiments like I was discussing earlier. Recognize that generalizations are useful for helping you ask the right question, but the minute a generalization makes you go, oh, well, this theory says that that can't happen, so I'm not even going to try it, you've just lost. For instance, and differences between people, differences between approaches are not the same, are not necessarily flaws. Like in one ecosystem, you would practically die if you don't have gills, like living underwater, whereas trying to live underwater with lungs is kind of a flaw. Living on land, lungs are great, gills are not great. Differences are not always flaws. And finally, never assume that you have all of the context on a given situation. You always make up part of the story when you try to understand what's going on, and try to be really aware of what parts of a story you're making up and question all of those. Go, what's the worst that could happen if every guess I've made in this situation is wrong? If that worst is really bad, then get more information before you act on it. So, applying these things as a free and open source software contributor. First important thing to be aware of are first impressions. People, as I've been saying to you, are really good at pattern recognition, and there are certain patterns among new contributors. There's this pattern of this person who comes in, asks a bunch of annoying questions, takes up a bunch of time, and never gives anything back. There's also a pattern of a promising newbie who comes in, learns a bunch, and becomes a good contributor. Figure out which pattern you want to fit. Identify what things will make you seem to fit that pattern, and then try to do them. Some things that are helpful here: conform to the channel or mailing list social norms that are going on, such as word choice, which list you post a given question to, and similar things, and ask your questions well. What I mean by asking good questions or asking your questions well is, first off, knowing what you want. Second off, showing that you read the documentation and that you tried to solve it yourself will make the person that you're asking very, very happy, especially if that was the person who wrote the documentation. And again, fitting into that pattern of contributors who've been useful to the project. I like modeling things as Mad Libs, such as, I want this tool to do this thing because here's my goal. At such and such a source, I read these things, which makes it seem like I should be able to get this from doing that. But when I try, here's what happens instead. And right there, you've preempted all of the questions that they're going to ask when you say, hey, it's broken. And by saving them that time and saving them the energy of prying the context out of you, you've just done a nice thing for the person who's going to help you and potentially given them a more positive opinion of you than they would have had otherwise. Another thing to keep in mind is that online communication has its own body language. For instance, your sentence length and structure and punctuation are a bit like a tone of voice. Your word choice, whether you use great big words like you would in an academic paper, or mildly offensive, poorly or less intellectually constructed words like you would in, let's say, a piece of graffiti, versus very vague buzzwordy stuff like you'd find perhaps in a political or marketing speech, will show people it's like your style of dress or the medium in which you communicate in MeetSpace. Interrupting a channel, especially a relatively synchronous channel like IRC, with off-topic or inane remarks is kind of like being fidgety and just always trying to get attention. Typing extremely slowly, unless the group that you're talking to knows that something is up, can have the same impediment as a mumble or a stutter, because by the time you've communicated your point, that moment has kind of passed. And your email address, your IRC handle, any email signatures or avatars that you choose convey the information that your age and style of dress and gender and haircut would in MeetSpace. Fortunately, those things are really easy to change and really easy to control to give the impression that you want, far more than the stuff that we're stuck with in quote-unquote real life. So speaking of email, some tricks to really effective email, which I'm sure a lot of you already know, but if you don't, consider the human emulator. Look at your own inbox and look at which important messages are still just sitting there and ask yourself why those ones haven't been dealt with yet. Probably because they're difficult. Probably because they're asking you to take a really big action or a difficult action, or it's hard to figure out from them exactly what's needed, or they require a big time investment. As someone who's sending the email, you can mitigate a lot of these things. Start by using a good title, recognizing that annoying as it is, a vast majority of people only see one request per message. So, and similarly, if you have a big wall of text explaining something and one of those sentences is much more important than the others, don't assume that your audience will know what's the important part. They will probably pick a different sentence from it and assume that that's the important part, and then it takes 3 or 4 more messages to figure out what pages you got onto and where the miscommunication came from. Summarizing with bullet points is always massively helpful because it allows people to skim faster and get the idea faster. And as I said with asking good questions, anticipate any questions that are going to be blocking them from taking the action that you want by knowing your audience and knowing your purpose. So with that, let's talk about how you get into an open source project. There are a variety of ways that people will tell you how you should get in. Some people will say, just use the project and fix a bug. Some people will say, find a contributor you know and get them to mentor you. Some people will say, oh, start your own project. It's a great way to find out about how things go. The way I personally recommend to people, I call it the help with install docs technique, because it gives you an unlimited number of get out of dumb question free cards. So people will tell you that there are no dumb questions. There are questions that make you feel dumb for needing to ask them. That's what I mean. So this technique is you basically start by trying to install the product, and you run into a problem. And then you fix the problem, and then you figure out what they could have said that would have prevented you from having that problem. And then you either look up their new contributor documentation, or you ask them, and while you're at it, ask them why they don't have new contributor documentation if it's missing, and offer to help with the install guide to prevent others from encountering that problem that you hit. Now, if the people are like, oh my gosh, you want to write docs for us? You're amazing. We like you. You found a very welcoming community, a community that's newbie friendly, and you've got an infinite get out of dumb question free cards. Because every time you feel like you have a dumb question, you go and you read through the docs and where you think it should be. You see if you can find the answer. If the answer is not there, you go up to a more experienced contributor and you go, so I found this thing that a newbie might have a problem with. I feel like it should be documented here. Here seems like a sensible place to look based on the other things I've been told, and it isn't. Can you tell me what the answer would be so I can write it down for you? And that will make them very happy. That will make them likelier to help you immediately because they know it will save them the effort of repeating themselves later on. And you don't sound necessarily like, oh, I'm so clueless. You sound like, oh, I'm looking out for everybody else and helping them, when in reality you get your own question answered too. However, if you go up to a project and you say, hey, I'd like to help you improve your docs, if they go, oh, we don't need newbie docs, our target audience should already know that, they're probably not the right project for you to be getting involved with right now. They're probably not a culture that's going to really nurture you and help you improve necessarily. And it might be better to find an alternate project to get involved with. Some people will say, oh, you can change the project culture. You've got to ask first, can I, with the amount of social influence that you have available to you and what you know about the motivations of the people who are running the project? And second, should I? Is it actually going to be more difficult to change an existing project or to make a fork or a peripheral organization for support or solve the problem in some other way? So, case study, what happens if a project seems to be ignoring your attempts to contribute? There's a few things you need to look at. First, is your expectation realistic? Let's say look at the other pull requests, look at the other attempts to contribute. If it usually takes them 2 months to get back to people and it's been two days, sit on it for another 2 months and see if they get back to you just like everybody else. If they usually get back to people in 2 days and it's been 2 months, figure out what you did wrong. Figure out who people usually get feedback from, and even consider asking that person, hey, what was different about my pull request that you didn't get back to me? And if you take that route, if you go to an individual and you say, hey, what am I doing wrong here? How can I get this code in? And then they give you some feedback, there is a right thing and a wrong thing to do. The right thing to do, if you, regardless of what you think of what they just said, is say, thank you very much for the feedback, and then leave them alone. Go either take it or don't take it, do whatever you want. The wrong thing to do is to argue with them and go, but I should be a special case, but I should be an exception because this, that, or the other thing. That will annoy them immensely, and they will never try to help you, at least probably under that handle, for as long as they remember that. Because you've just set a pattern of, oh, when this person pings me, they're just going to be a bunch of trouble. Perhaps also something is blocking them. Something is getting in the way, taking up all of their time, taking up all of their energy, and just keeping them from getting around to your contribution. This is a time where you try and figure out if it's something you can help with. Oftentimes it won't be. Oftentimes it'll just be real life getting in the way, their job got busy, something like that. But sometimes it's, we have way too many newbies and they're just constantly demanding attention, or, but I'm making it standards compliant for this because we need that at a certain time. And if it's something you can help with, then at least make an effort to, as long as it's not going to take up a whole lot more time and ultimately hinder them. And when you're trying to wrangle really busy people, there are some magic words that I'm going to teach you. These words are, when shall I remind you? If a really busy person says, oh yeah, I want to get back to it, but I've got this stuff going on at work, I'll get back to you, or I can get back to you later, you go, when shall I remind you to take a look at this? And then they'll say something like, oh yeah, next week, or Tuesday, or something like that. Then you put that on your calendar, and the ball is in your court, and it's not hideously awkward for you to just go, hey, you said you wanted, when it's Tuesday, of course, hey, you said you wanted me to remind you on Tuesday about this thing. And if they go, oh, I'm busy again, it's another, when shall I remind you? And then it's your problem rather than theirs, because odds are really good that you have more bandwidth than they do. So this brings us to social hierarchies and social capital. We say, oh, it's just a meritocracy, it's just all lines of code. It's also a meritocracy of the respect that everyone has for other people's contributions and the reputations that everybody has. So social karma or popularity, look at this, again, human emulator, I just keep coming back to this. How do you judge other people? How do you decide whether a person is influential in a project or not? How do you decide whether it's someone whose opinion you want? Identify those traits and then try to control how others see those traits in you. Often, the easiest way to control how somebody else sees you, just change your behavior. One really important thing is not lying to try to sound cool. There aren't really cheats to climb a social ladder that are that easy. For instance, there's a story that in Google interviews, if they'll have you rate yourself on various skills, if you rate yourself as a total expert in a given tool, oftentimes they'll bring in the original author of the tool to your interview to ask you esoteric questions about how it works. So be careful there. You can't really cheat or hack like that. And be aware when we're talking about social capital that making recommendations is a gamble of how people see you, how people view your reputation. And it's a gamble proportionate to the amount of pain that will happen if the person you recommended is really bad at what they do. For instance, if you know a project that's hiring and you say, oh, you should hire such and so, they're really good at this technology, and they turn out to be great, that project will think better of you because you helped them find a great person and you assess the situation accurately. You refer them to somebody who's terrible at it and sets them back a ways by doing some really bad work, they are not going to think more highly of you. They will think less of you for causing them that trouble. And this brings us to leadership. So leadership tends to happen to people who work hard, are reliable, and are bad at saying no. Yeah, the nods and the kind of knowing smiles. You say this to a room full of people who've been in leadership positions, and that's really kind of how it goes. Here are some things that I wish somebody had told me back when I started leading groups of people, usually groups of engineers. So again, with the human emulator point, which leaders do you look up to, and why do you look up to them? Whatever you think that makes somebody else a good leader is often something that you should try to cultivate as well. And in free and open source software, we talk about meritocracies. In a meritocracy, basically the currency is the amount you care, often measured in lines of code, can be measured in enthusiasm and time spent, but that's a project culture specific thing. So first thing as a leader, let's say you accidentally fall into a position of leadership or you convince people to elect you, either way, is to know your audience. Know the people whom you're trying to lead. Know their goals, their priorities, what they're ultimately trying to get out of being in the project, which will often vary from person to person. Know as much as you can about the culture that they're in and how much energy, time, and resources they have available. This will help you ask people for the best they can do without alienating them by asking them for more than is possible for them right then. Part of knowing your audience is being familiar with the culture of the group. So you can foster accountability and consistency. I've never seen a place where that's problematic in a group, where that's bad for a culture. You can try to give people the benefit of the doubt and assume that they chose the best of the options that they saw as being available to change their future behavior. You can add more options to them. And it sounds buzzwordy, but empowering the group. You give people perceived buy-in or perceived investment in what you're doing, and then if they want a thing to happen, make it so that they can make it happen themselves. With the most important thing to know about group culture is you can't just say, oh, we don't have a culture. You can't say, our culture is going to be thus. There's already a culture there if it's a group. It's part of what defines a group of people. And so try to get people to be as honest as you can with you about what the culture is like, because then you can understand where it's at in order to change it in whatever direction you'd like to. One thing that's often talked about, and you can't really discuss culture without, is talking about diversity. Diversity of thought is much more beneficial to a group than diversity of appearance. And the best way, I think, that you can foster diversity is identifying the assumptions that you've made about all of your users. Who is everybody who uses your project? Is it everyone who has a computer? Is it everyone who likes Linux? What about the people who don't have computers? What about the people who don't like Linux? Are there people in those groups that you've omitted in defining your group who could be advantageous if you had them involved? Bear in mind that discrimination is inconsistent enforcement of rules based on some trait about people. Sometimes it's okay to have inconsistent rules based on a trait that people can change, such as your commit bit. You're not going to hand that out to just everybody. You're going to hand it out based on traits like being a reliable contributor, writing good code, having consistent contributions. And privilege means private law. So when you have different rules, again, applying to different people, make sure that your groups that you're forming with these things are with the different rules, special situations, and so forth. Make sure those lines are drawn where it makes sense for your project, not in arbitrary places they just happen to end up that don't make sense. Such as if you have an open source project where a lot of the contributors live in the same place, but some people in a different time zone are trying to get involved, you can often accidentally just leave them out completely if you go and have a discussion at the bar or around the water cooler at work that doesn't ever end up on the mailing list. You'll just leave those people out because you made the assumption, oh, everybody involved in this design decision is here, right? Well, wrong. So again, be careful of what you're assuming about your contributors and where that's going to take your project culture. So another point around project culture and diversity is What do you do with trolls? There are trolls on the internet, and occasionally they will wander into your projects and cause problems. Some of the things you can do, you can have a clear code of conduct and clear expectations that reflect the community's standards. If you don't have a code of conduct yet, this is problematic. To bring one in, get buy-in from the group, especially if it's the kind of buy-in where people say, okay, I recognize that we need this, I'll go with what the group chooses, and then vote or select it in a way that everyone's agreed on. If someone has bought in and said, yes, I agree that we need this, I'll go with what the group says, then even if it isn't precisely what they wanted, they will feel kind of obligated to stick with it, more so than if they feel like they had no say whatsoever in it, and it was just imposed upon them. So to prevent the harm that a troll can do once they're in, oh yeah, the other thing about codes of conduct is, yes, they help protect individuals in your group, but that's not the only thing they do. They also protect the group from having a mishandled situation if something bad does start happening. Look at the impact on a group when there is no code of conduct or it doesn't have a clear situation. Here's a clear clause of, if you feel like something bad has happened, here is what you do, here's the escalation policy, here's how we'll handle it. People will just take it to public social media that doesn't check its sources and say really mean things that may or may not be true, and that doesn't help anybody. So keeping communications on the record is a really helpful preemptive troll-proofing kind of measure. Prevents people from saying, oh, but they told me this or they didn't tell me that, having that proof there. And it also encourages you as a leader to behave better when someone's being incredibly frustrating, knowing that it's on your own records. And if that doesn't work, if people come in and you as a leader are like, why are you being such a troll? Why are you being terrible? Why are you doing these things that don't make sense? First thing is to try to understand why they did it. Maybe they had some good reason. Maybe they felt like it was the only way to get something that's important to them, and what's important to them is actually the same thing that's important to your group. I mean, that's really optimistic, but it could be. There's also a kind of counter-troll where, well, not really counter-troll, but trolling in the opposite direction, where someone will pretend to get really offended by something that wasn't necessarily a valid thing for them to be expecting in the first place. One thing that I found that helps in those situations is asking if they're making unreasonable requests, is to ask them to propose rules that could be fairly applied to the entire group that would have prevented the problem. That can sometimes help them become a bit more aware of the context and whether or not their expectation is reasonable for them to ask of you as a leader and of the group as a whole. But sometimes trolls are just jerks. Sometimes people just want to cause harm in the world, and they'll say things about lulz, or they just want attention and they'll get it however they can. Sometimes it's necessary to get people out of projects. This should be a last resort, of course. Figure out whether their behavior was, whether it happened to you because it was a path of least resistance, or if they had insufficient information about what was going on, or if they have a personal grief against somebody in the group that they're out to attack. And still, though, try to avoid going, I'm right and you're wrong, because that will potentially alienate other contributors as well. So speaking of people getting out, another problem, or one problem that can occur when you've been dealing with a bunch of this kind of thing, is burnout. A few tricks for managing burnout, a few tips, are that it can happen when you think that everyone has a bunch of expectations of you, and you think, oh, I've got to do all of these things, and there's none of these that I can just set aside and take a break. Bear in mind that drop balls are not noticed as much as the person dropping them tends to expect, especially if you tend to be a perfectionist, tend to be bad at saying no, that trait of leadership. So don't assume that people's expectations of you are unreasonably high unless you've actually talked to the people and found out what they think. Let's say, though, that you do notice that you're just losing enthusiasm for a project. You've been leading it for a while. It's just not your thing anymore. You're starting to get sick of it, and you're kind of starting to burn out. The minute you realize that this is not going to be your thing for a while, even before you realize that, you should start delegating and start preparing for a leadership handoff. So a few of the things you can do in order to delegate better and to make your own job easier are to basically try to automate everything. You can automate, like deploying the website with a script. That's easy and obvious. How do you automate running a meeting? How do you automate sending the weekly email to everybody? How do you automate organizing your annual conference? One of the easiest answers there are checklists. Have a checklist for here's when to do it, here's what to do, and here's how we did it last time. And then every time you're doing that recurring task, use the same checklist. Not only because you need to know, you need to not skip the steps, which it helps with that too. There's a reason that NASA still uses checklists for space shuttle takeoffs, even though everybody knows what they're doing. It also helps you keep the list up to date so that if someone else needs to follow it instead of yourself, they can go through and they won't have to be second-guessing it and double-checking it and going, this is 5 years out of date. And bear in mind with delegation that successful leadership is when everybody else does the work for you. If you have any single point of failure, we call it the bus problem in software, which if one person got hit by a bus, would the project be able to survive, or do they have unique knowledge that isn't documented anywhere? There's actually, as a side note, a really cool tool called Git by a Bus that can analyze your repository and say, hey, these parts of the code have only been touched by that one contributor. Might want to get some other people working on them. And again, that word empower. Give minions, am I allowed to call them minions? The people you delegate to, the ability, and give them everything they need to do stuff for you. And always remember that knowing that a thing will happen is exactly the same as knowing who will do that thing. Don't let the bystander effect get you. Don't let that somebody else's problem field from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy cover a task until it just doesn't get done. Now, one of the strongest excuses against delegation that I've heard is, but it won't get done in time. There's a trick for timing when you're delegating tasks. So a task will have a deadline, like I've marked it there in red. A task will have a window in which, if you just really went campaign mode, pulled all-nighters, you could get it done. This is about the window that you're probably going to be getting it done in anyway if you're incredibly busy. So those are the dark gray squares. And then it has this window before that, the light gray squares in this diagram, where somebody who was really on the ball and really organized could get it done if they were really prepped and thinking ahead. And then the green is the first day when you could be working on this task, like when the call for proposals gets announced, when you book the venue, any of those things. The trick is, when you delegate to someone, set their deadline at the end of that window in which you could do it in a leisurely manner, and before the start of that window when you could do it yourself. And then you give them all that time to do it. If they don't do it, well, you're not really out a whole lot because you probably would have been doing it in this time slot anyways. And it gives them a chance to be involved and to take some accountability, take some ownership of the project and get better at doing it themselves as well. So with leadership handoffs, again, start as soon as possible. Start before you realize that the handoff is coming up. It'll make life easier for you, not just for the newbies. Automate yourself out of a job. Sharing responsibilities is really important, and if you're still going to be around when the new leader has come in, especially if that leader is uncertain of themselves, they're like, I guess I'll try it, but I really don't know how to run this group yet. Lead through them for a while. Give them those hints and those nudges. Be like, hey, if it were this time of year, I'd be doing this. This time of year, I'd be doing that if I was still in charge. And that can lead to a much smoother transition for the entire group. So another thing about leadership and about involvement that I'd like to talk to you about is teaching. This is really kind of the know your audience problem, and it's something that I've noticed a lot of speakers do. So the way you learn the given thing often has a lot of impact on how you teach that thing. If you learned it from a man page, you are probably likelier to teach it well in a similar style and so forth. But even really well-taught information is useless if the audience doesn't have the background or perspective in order to understand it. So that thing that presenters always do, they'll ask the audience, hey, how many of you don't know about this thing? So you're sitting here in a talk at SCaLE. I say, does anybody here not know about like depth first search, because we're talking about algorithms? So actually raise your hands if you don't know about depth first search. So there's like one hand. Okay. Now we're going to have a poll. Thank you for bringing a computer. Please, if you have a thing with a web browser, pull it out, seriously, and go to poll.edunham.net. And if you're one of the many, many people who knows about depth first search and didn't raise your hands, tell me, just like in a sentence in the text box, what it is and how it works or how you'd implement it. And once you hit, and if you don't know, it's okay. You can hit the I don't know box. If you can't figure out how to like explain it or summarize it or prove that you know it. And then once you've hit submit on that, it'll show you the things that everyone else has answered with. And I'm going to guess that we'll see more than one I don't know. This is just an idle speculation here. So, excellent. We'll see how many of these are copied and pasted out of Wikipedia. And would you have actually used Wikipedia in the middle of a talk? Is the thing. If somebody's about to teach you a new topic, maybe you would. Maybe you wouldn't take the time to do that. My carefully calculated drink of water break, so I can keep talking for 2 more minutes-ish. It's only about 2 more minutes worth of content. So as you submit that poll, I'm just going to go. Let's do the poll, and then let's say, and then let's see what everybody said. So 70%, 21 out of 30 respondents right now have said, I don't know. So this is how I hoped it would go. This is better than the demos the last time I gave this talk. Thank you, by the way, to Lucy for writing us the really pretty little web app like yesterday when I realized I needed a poll. Lucy, you're awesome. Now, oops. I should probably tab back to the actual slides if I want you to be able to see them. So the results here. The impression that I got from the raise of hands is, oh yeah, I can just keep going assuming my audience knows this and jump right into a bunch of technical details. And the ones who don't know, oh, they'll be okay, they'll figure it out along the way. The actual results were that a huge majority of the group would have benefited from at least a quick review of the topic. So I've seen that done a whole lot. I've seen that done here. I've seen that done other places. It's kind of standard practices. And it's an example of a really powerful conformity effect. When people think that they should already know a given topic, they'll claim to know it, or they won't volunteer to stand out as a tiny minority of not knowing. And so for your audience to get the most out of a given talk, moral here is plan on repeating things for them anyways. Don't assume that your audience will be totally honest in admitting the things that they don't know. So yes, that's the point I wanted to prove, and thank you guys for being like my human guinea pigs. I thought it would go that way, but I wasn't sure. So we have, we're right on 4 o'clock. So if you wanted to leave at 4 o'clock, this is your chance. Otherwise, questions and answers. Okay, yes. On the knowing your audience part, what about the way you ask the question? If you say, who here knows about, and then try to count how many people aren't raising their hands, that's logistically really challenging if the room is packed. And again, you will hit something of a conformity effect. Oh, great, everybody else knows this. I'll just pretend to know this. So there's basically those positive and negatives. If you can phrase the question in a way that doesn't make people sound bad for not knowing, that can potentially help. But at the end of the day, it's still a big group. People are still going to look around and observe others and experience some form of peer pressure. Questions, answers? Yes, question.
So my question was, especially with the depth first search.
Depth first search, yes.
Yes. There was no context given to that, and especially how it applies to, let's say, going through a graph tree or something like that. Like, if this was a talk on graph databasing, it would make a lot more sense if that was there, but there was no context given.
Okay, yes, the point that he's making is that I just asked you a question out of the blue with no context. That was somewhat intentional. I was much more going for the effect of just people seeing the peer pressure of... The question was chosen for being something that a bunch of computer nerds should feel like they need to know, or feel obligated to already know. I had a few others for if like everybody's like, nah, I don't want to answer it. I had a few backup questions. Choosing an arbitrary question to just spring on people is never really that great. Had the talk been focused on a specific technology, could have grabbed a question about that technology and had a much more realistic effect. You're absolutely right.
Question about conformity effect.
Yes.
One of the things as faculty member that I haven't quite been able to get going in the engineering department is use something like iClicker, where you would basically have a clicker with given in a question like that, it can answer true or false, and it can all be anonymous until after you've done the calculation. So how would that help to eliminate conformity?
Yeah, so the question there is, in teaching in an academic setting, would clickers help, which is you give everybody a little piece of technology that lets them vote anonymously, lets them answer a question anonymously. Would that help mitigate conformity effects? Absolutely. My own university tries to do this. Yeah, it gets around conformity effects, but they demand that everybody buys a little proprietary clicker, and it makes people very mad. I prefer the anonymous web form approach because kids have a phone or laptop in class anyways. But yes, if people don't know how others are voting, then they're not going to experience the same peer pressure. Yeah, Jordan? Yeah, Jordan was pointing out that students will talk among themselves about what the answer is because often with clickers it's for the grade too. Tom, you had your hand up first. Okay, so the question is, you've got an established project with a bunch of developers, but none of them want to lead, and the current leader needs to step out. Do you just step out and let it keep going under its own momentum? I would say what I've done in a similar situation is talk to them individually, figure out why they like the project, what they think they're getting from being part of the project, how participation benefits them, whether it's satisfaction in life or accomplishing their goals or impressing their friends or whatever. And then figure out why they're unwilling to step up to leadership. Often it's just a lack of confidence. They're like, I don't have all the skills yet. You get the skills by doing it, but not everyone really internalizes that. So if there's someone who cares enough about the project, has the motivation to potentially be a good, and the competence to potentially be a good leader, you can often talk to them about your own leadership experiences, and say, hey, I really didn't know all this when I started either. Here's this funny story about how bad I screwed up when I was a noob. And generally make them comfortable, give them reassurance, figure out what they're most scared of. Like, so if you were in charge, what would worry you? Like, what would be the worst part? Oh, I wouldn't have anyone to turn to if I had a question that I didn't know how to answer. Reassure them that you will be there if you can, or give them the resources to deal with that. Make them feel prepared, and then show them how taking on the leadership role will give them more of whatever good thing they're getting out of participating. If what they're getting from participating isn't something that would be improved by leading, then they're probably not the right person to be grooming for future leadership. You had a question over here? Yeah, my URL, I used the wrong one because I'm a bad person. Yes, it is lowercase scale 13x. Yes, there we go. That slide has the right URL on it. And now I've had my terrible tech fail for the talk. Let's hope. Question back there.
So in terms of hacking people,
Mm-hmm.
what about trolling the project for fun and profit in the sense of using Cunningham's law, putting the wrong answer out there to get the right answer?
Okay, trolling for fun and profit, using Cunningham's law to get the right answer by putting the wrong answer out there. Yes, you are leveraging people's desire for social status by allowing them to publicly correct you. You're giving them this low-hanging fruit of an opportunity to look cool in front of their friends, and people will just snap it up. As long as the people who snap it up actually know the right answer, that's awesome. Questions, comments? I see no hands. Thank you all very much for being here and for listening to me and for listening to me go overtime with the Q&A. The slides are actually at that URL.